This time of year, our evenings are often filled with the nearly deafening sound of the mating calls of the male cicadas. It won't last long, though. If you'll look around when you take a walk anywhere in the Ozarks, you'll see the remains of these very loud summertime lovers. The cicada is born as a worm, usually from an egg sac carefully placed in a cut in the bark of a tree, a cut made by a female cicada where she lays her eggs, and when the eggs hatch, they drop to the ground, and they dig down just about a foot, and there they live in the damp darkness of the earth, feeding off of the fluids of roots, mostly from the tree from which they fell. And they will live there, sometimes for decades, year after year, never seeing sunlight, never gazing on a blue sky. In fact, they don't have eyes. But after 13 or 17 years, when the temperature of the soil is just right, the worms will crawl up out of the ground and they will climb up on the tree where they have fed for years, and there they are transformed. One of the most amazing transformations in nature. What we are hearing these days is the Kansan brood number 4 cicada. They were born in 1998 and have been feeding on root juice since then. In a matter of days of crawling out of the ground, they will grow legs and eyes and amazing wings. And these former worms will take to the air and burst into a lusty song in the warm summer days and mate with partners in their gathering trees for a week or two, and then they die. I see the exhausted remains of these large bugs on the sidewalk near my home, and I want to ask, well, Romeo, was it worth it? If you ever wonder why you see box turtles out on the road during the spring and summer and at no other times, it's the same thing. They are risking their lives, slowly walking out in traffic in search of love. Well, sex at least, but turtle love. There are no evangelical worms among the roots of trees warning the congregation against the perils of growing wings and flying, which can lead only to very noisy sex and nearly immediate death. There are no box turtle mothers lecturing their sons. You are the slowest animal on 4 feet. Never walk in the road. There are no moral deliberations to sex in most of nature. The reproductive lives of insects, fish, mammals, reptiles, the ultimate birds and the bees, evolved in ways that serve the survival of the species. Though you have to admit that that whole thing about growing a new body, legs and eyes and wings, that's outrageously elaborate. It still embodies no will. There's no decision-making involved in that. There's no morality. It just is. Morality is a human invention, and a relatively recent one at that. So recent, in fact, that it does not appear to have yet affected the entire population. Sexual behavior is instinctive in all living things. In some, to serve the evolutionary survival of the species, there are things that look like family, or a herd, a tribe, a flock. Sometimes even monogamy will emerge in nature. And even in nature, though it is instinctive, it's not always about propagation. Marine scientists insist that dolphins have sex for fun. And anyone who's spent much time on the farm knows that homosexuality is not found only in humans, but in every animal in nature. Clearly, sexual contact is a part of the bonding relationship that makes survival in this cruel world possible. It's not always about propagation. Sometimes it is just about building relationships and the intimacy that makes it possible to survive. The difference between animals and humans is that we have become self-aware, and therefore we've developed the ability to communicate through speech, and that leads to the building of civilizations and things like houses and cars and farms and boats, and eventually that meant that once Once what came naturally to us now requires definitions and laws replete with lawyers, tabloids, the whole industry of pornography and its cousins in the fields of fashion and cosmetics. I've done a lot of relief work in Nicaragua, and for many years I served on the board of the Rainbow Network with several other very good and well-intended people who desperately wanted to help the poor who lived in the villages of the impoverished jungles in the Matagalpa region of Nicaragua. And we had this one couple from Ohio that was on our board, and they were great fundraisers. They brought a lot of money to the Rainbow Network, but they insisted that if they were going to contribute, that we had to teach abstinence education in our education classes. Now, Nicaragua is very close to the equator. So in Nicaragua, there's 12 hours of daylight and there's 12 hours of night every day. And in the villages where we worked, there's no electricity, so there's no TV, there's no radio, there's no movies, there's no distractions. They were so poor they didn't know musical instruments, and most couldn't even afford a candle. So you got 12 hours of darkness and nothing else every day. And this very puritanical couple wanted us to teach our adolescent friends in these villages not to have sex. And I tried to say to them, quite unsuccessfully I might add, is that human civilization, with all of its rules, morality, its ethical ideas, is less than 10,000 years old. Human civilization is a little over 9,000 years of practice. Human evolution, with all of its reproductive and sexual impulses, more than 2 million years old. So in the dark nights of a Nicaraguan jungle, a clash between civilization and its rules and evolution with its instinctive drives, evolution. But that's not to say that everywhere you look in Matagalpa you see pregnant teenagers, or that there are mothers who do not know who the fathers of their babies are. It's not that civilization and its scruples do not have some management influence on instinct. I'm just saying that in matters of sexual relationships, evolution always has the upper hand. With many of my religious peers, I get very frustrated with educated clergy who resist acknowledging that there is no distinct and forever religious ideal of sexual norms. The 20th century Western ideal of a man and a woman being faithfully married to one another for life has been fairly rare in its realization anyway. But even still, it is a late comer to human civilization. For most of biblical history, having lots of wives was viewed as God's blessings on a man. I don't think it could have been viewed as a blessing on the woman, but multiple wives was the intentional, promoted view of marriage. Men in antiquity were encouraged to grow the size of their tribe, their clan, any way that they could, even through sexual slavery. It was encouraged to capture childbearing females from neighboring countries and to have children with them. And it was not until the land that they were occupying was faced with overcrowding and limited resources that the rules began to change. It's not that the Lord God Almighty changes sex rules, it's that the needs of society changed. So when propagation became a problem rather than a necessity, then the rules began to change. Modern critics of Islam accuse the Prophet of having been a pedophile because one of his wives, Aisha, was only 6 years old when Muhammad married her and 9 years old when he consummated the marriage. And while anyone who did such a thing in the modern era would certainly be considered a pedophile and would be imprisoned for life, and even though in Muhammad's day there were people who objected, I mean, it wasn't that every man in that era married a child, but still, when Muhammad did it, it was not uncommon, and it was accepted by that culture. Our wisdom lesson today comes from the well-known account of King David's affair with Bathsheba, and David's another prominent religious figure who was popularly called a man after God's own heart. I mean, he was an ideal character. Muslims tend to view Muhammad as having been the most perfect human being who ever lived, who had a 9-year-old wife. David had many wives. We don't know exactly how many, but he had lots of wives, none of whom had a personal choice in the matter of being a wife of David. Many of whom had been captured as spoils of war and became a part of his harem. But even in that barbaric context, even the king could not have someone else's wife. There was tremendous shame and guilt associated with this affair, so much so that David even concocted a murder to hide his sin. He had Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, killed on the battlefield. Very often, these scandals reveal not only the hypocrisy of an individual public figure, but also the hypocrisy of social norms and expectations. It seems like we never get tired of hearing about political sex scandals, that it's the politician that advocates for abstinence-only education whose teenage daughter ends up pregnant. It's the anti-gay congressman that winds up in an airport soliciting sex from an undercover policeman who was pretending to be a male prostitute. Following the advent of the creation of effective birth control and the legalization of abortion, we began to hear Americans coming to terms with a new understanding of sexual morals. And the phrase most often heard was that sex between consenting adults is no one else's business. Now, it's a very simple and very straightforward proposition that removes cultural prejudices against same-sex relationships or interracial or interreligious relationships. But it also simultaneously opens a huge debate in what it means to consent. We all agree that children cannot meaningfully give consent, and we define adulthood at 18. 17 is not an adult, 16 is a child, 18 is an adult. And for that reason, for many years, college professors were the worst predators in being able to solicit sexual relationships from the students that populated their classrooms. It wasn't until the 1980s that universities began to lay down the law about ethical conduct, even among what otherwise might have been viewed as a consenting relationship. But we would not be inclined to charge two 16-year-olds with a crime for having engaged in adolescent sex. But we might if one was 16 and the other was 20. And of course, we've all had to witness this remarkable unfolding account of Bill Cosby's use of drugs in a career-long casting couch practice that was well known but broadly ignored by his peers for 30 years. And now that this conduct has been revealed, Bill Cosby himself seems to be shocked that people are despising him for this. He does not seem to be aware that he was doing anything wrong. But Bill Cosby's not alone in it. One of my favorite all-time authors, the famous psychiatrist M. Scott Peck, his book, The Road Less Traveled, was on the New York Times best-selling list for more than 25 years. I mean, he's an incredibly influential thinker, but even in that best-selling book, he acknowledges in his psychiatric practice that he sometimes had sex with his clients. I've met Scott Peck a few times and heard him lecture, and I'm pretty sure that he did not have sex with obese older women. He was very selective about which ones of his clients could benefit from sexual contact with their therapist, and it was almost always the women that he thought he would like to have sex with. By the end of the 20th century, if he had done that, he would have had a jail cell right next to Muhammad. But in the time that it took place, in the late 70s and 80s, his wife Lily didn't even divorce him over it, and he had published his infidelity. But there are still more fine points to consider is legitimate consent. In the past couple of years, the book 50 Shades of Grey seems to have raised the question, is it rape if the perpetrator is really, really rich? And indeed, there seems to be no problem in finding any number of women who are willing to be paraded in sexual exploitation obscenities called Who Wants to Marry a Millionaire? There are countries that have legalized prostitution. In so doing, they appear to have reduced the instances of rape and sexually transmitted diseases, and yet thinking people are forced to wonder how many women actually enter the sex trade willingly. Most are either victims of molestation or victims of trafficking. They've been tricked, coerced, lied to force them into the sex trade. And no matter how much we want to defend free speech and oppose censorship, you cannot escape the awareness that most women who work in the pornography trade did not end up there just because they thought it was a good career move. For cicadas and box turtles, there's not much conversation around morality. For humans, there's no end to discussion, redefining and trying to work our way towards what is equitable, what is just, in this matter of both the greatest personal privacy. I mean, there's really nothing more sacred and more private about your life than your intimacy, and yet it is also the aspect of human relationships that has the greatest potential for abuse, for psychological damage, and for exploitation. I hope in the 21st century that the Catholic Church has learned that its practice of celibacy is not only unnatural, but it is inevitably going to lead to perversion and abuse. I hope that both the right-wing politicians and evangelical religious leaders can look at the scandals within their own ranks and see how absurd their abstinence-only priorities are, and that they are, in fact, abstinence-only policies are a piece of the same cloth as the Catholic Church's institutional insanity regarding what is and what is not a healthy relationship. Universities that were remarkably late to the table in realizing that there can be no meaningful consent between a professor and a student are finally also realizing that even within the student population, there can be no meaningful consent between students if one of them is intoxicated or high, whether they ingested those intoxicants willingly or unknowingly. Neither silence nor acquiescence is tantamount to consent. So what can a church that is married both to concepts of individual freedom and social responsibility say about sex in the 21st century? There is no biblical passage, nor is there a technical medical definition that will entirely suffice. In the end, I can only tell you what I believe, and you are not only free to disagree, you are encouraged to think about it and work this out for yourself. And I welcome thoughtful, reasoned responses to what I have to say. But I've got 4 points I want to make. The first is that sex between consenting adults should be considered to be a private and entirely personal matter, free from the judgment of either the church or your neighbors. Still, consent is a matter of vital importance and should not be polluted ever with power or coercion of any sort. On the other side of that equation, we have to decide that we're not going to listen to gossip. We're not going to pay attention to news reports about politicians' personal sex lives. We're not going to start or repeat gossip. And we're not going to try to invade anyone else's private lives to do them harm or just to satisfy our own curiosity. Secondly, I want to say that sex should be approached with mutual respect and with an informed awareness that for humans it's almost never recreational. It may be for a porpoise, it may be for a box turtle, but sex always means something, always. Oftentimes means more to one than the other, but it means something, and it has the potential of great personal harm. So it should never be entered into only to scratch your own itch, to meet your own needs, but it should always be entered into with an awareness that if both parties are not having a meaningful and beneficial relationship, the that you just shouldn't get involved. Thirdly, I want to say that divorce is neither evil nor is it to be applauded. Many people are an excellent match for one another at one stage of life. And we diminish these things sometimes. We'll talk about a starter marriage or something. But we live a long time. And some relationships that are meaningful at one phase of life can become toxic in another stage of life. And society and individuals, nor God, has any benefit to derive from forcing people to stay in unhealthy unions. However, there's a great deal to praise in marriages that last a long time, because those are people who have learned how to solve problems. They can grow together through adversity. They can foster the kind of communication that rises above the challenges that prove to be fatal to other unions. We should not judge those who choose to part company, but we should celebrate those who show the rest of us how two thoughtful people can succeed where so many of us have failed. Let me tell you, never envy your single friends. Trust me, for none of us was that our first choice. None of us wanted to end up at this place in life. So don't envy the liberty and freedom of those that are single, because we would all rather be in a meaningful, mutually loving relationship. Fourth, and finally, thank you for your patience. I'd like to encourage you to see your sexuality not as a source of shame and guilt, because we're a lot more like box turtles than we are like gods. We are still animals. We have evolutionary instincts. We should not associate shame and guilt with our sexuality. It's something that should be fun. We should be able to be playful about it. We should be full of good humor and happy memories. It does not only give us the gift of children, but it can also be a part of the cement of trust, vulnerability, affection, and intimacy that binds two people one to another. But I recognize in our liberated society that there are those who will choose to believe that sexual intimacy should be pursued without conscience or concern for consequences. And to those people, I can only say this: you should try to grow a pair of wings, but don't expect it to end well.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.